for lunch. We're going to start panel 2, entitled, Does this relationship need to be managed? Conflicted over conflict of interest. I'm your moderator, Hiromi Sanders, from the Office of the Vice President for Research at George Washington University. For this panel, we will provide a brief overview of the heightened U.S. government scrutiny on conflict of interest due to the safeguarding of research against undue foreign influence. We'll talk about how to navigate disclosures when the university, health systems, and the government requirements are not yet in sync. Explore some of the conflicts that arise in the conduct of clinical research and best practices for mitigating bias and coercion. And we'll conclude with a discussion about the significance of balancing compliance and flexibility to facilitate swift response to COVID-19 research. I will go ahead and ask our panelists to raise your hand so that our text can find you. And it is my pleasure to introduce a wonderful lineup this afternoon. We will begin with Katherine Cohen. She will be the leadoff. Katherine, Kate, is Chief Compliance Officer of Southern Illinois University Medicine, in which she leads the compliance program for the SIU School of Medicine, the SIU Physicians and Surgeons, and the SIU Federally Qualified Health Center, responsible for physician billing, auditing, and compliance, referral issues, conflict of interest, research compliance, research integrity, and privacy. Next, we will have Mary Schmiedel, who is the Senior Director, Office of Research Oversight at Georgetown University. She serves as a Chief Conflict of Interest Officer for the main campus and medical center and carries university-wide responsibility for export controls and research integrity. And then we'll conclude with James Bosco, who is the director of the MedStar Health Research Institute Office of Research Integrity, primarily responsible for the regulatory oversight of clinical and preclinical research for MedStar Health. Panelists, when you are ready, please note to turn your cameras on. We will take questions at the end of the presentations. Please be sure, audience, to submit your questions through the Q&A box. And with that, Kate, take it away.
Thank you so much. Thank you to everyone who's joining us today. I'm going to talk a little bit about foreign influence, foreign components, and increased government scrutiny that we're experiencing currently. We could go to the next slide, please. So the NIH has long had rules related to disclosure requirements for foreign components of research and other support that needs to be reported on applications. But in July 2019, they issued a reminder of what those requirements were and gave us a little bit of a deeper glimpse into their stance on some of these issues. So as a reminder, NIH requires that in grant applications, other support and foreign components are disclosed as part of that application. Other support being defined as all resources that are made available to the researcher in support of or related to all of their research endeavors, regardless of that monetary value. So both financial and in-kind support, with foreign components also being required to be disclosed and being defined as the existence of any scientific element or segment of a project outside of the United States. So why do they want us to disclose this as part of the application process? They're concerned about loss of intellectual property to foreign countries. They want to prevent scientific, budgetary, and commitment overlap. There's limited funds to go around from NIH for research, and they want to make sure it's used appropriately. They want to prevent confidential information sharing that's received by peer reviewers in the grant process, and ensure that they're aware of any foreign government support of research that they may also be supporting. What does this mean for us? It means additional disclosures to federal agencies as part of the grant application process, foreign collaborations, adjunct professor appointments, honorary appointments, paid and unpaid, study personnel who are volunteers or visitors paid by other organizations. And so The July 2019 reminder from NIH has a long list of things that are required to be reported as part of those applications. Next slide, please. So we mentioned that there was increased government scrutiny about these issues within research, and we have listed here 6 headlines from either press releases or large publications that represent just a sampling of the headlines related to this issue from 2020 alone. So since January of this year. And you can see that the headlines are sensational, of course, but all center around failure to disclose or alleged spying as it relates to research by foreign governments or foreign nationals. And you can also see the geographic spread of this from Kansas to Florida to Boston to West Virginia. It's across the country. And these are only a few of them. So we are looking at increased government scrutiny, increased public scrutiny. And if nothing else, right, we want to make sure that none of our institutions end up the subject of one of these sensational headlines. Next slide, please. So how would an institution know about foreign components or other support? It's really important to have processes in place to solicit this information, make sure you are aware of appointments and other things by your staff. Does your conflict of interest policy state the requirement to disclose work or financial interests or in-kind support received from a foreign institution? You know, many of our research conflict of interest policies focus on those public health service regulations and may not call out the foreign components and in-kind support or appointments that your researchers may have. And so if your policy doesn't explicitly discuss that, consider adding it in there. Is foreign travel by your employees or faculty vetted by an export controls office or something similar? Do you even know when your employees or faculty members are heading to a foreign country to do work or for personal reasons? Is that something that you require to be disclosed? And if so, how do you manage that? Have you communicated and educated your researcher population about what their obligations are in terms of disclosure to you as an institution and what the institutional obligations are in terms of disclosure to federal agencies? If you haven't, and if you have not conducted some significant education around these obligations, that's probably a good place to start as well. As with so many things that we run into in a compliance setting and research compliance setting, most of it stems from that folks just didn't know what their obligations were and we didn't tell them enough or in a way that they understood. And so that communication and education is really important. Look at your disclosure points. Where are you soliciting this information? Are you soliciting it in multiple places? I'm going to talk a little bit about the potential problems with multiple disclosure points. And are all individuals who might receive those disclosures familiar with foreign components, other support, red flags, just issue spotting for this type of thing to know when to raise their hand if a disclosure comes in that they think should be escalated elsewhere? Is there a part of your grant process that you have this information solicited? If so, is there communication between those two, your grant office and the conflict of interest office? I'm going to go into this case study, which is a hypothetical. A researcher at a university with multiple campuses is conducting an NIH-sponsored study. And this research is employed by Campus A, but he's conducting the study through a grant that was submitted and administered by Campus B's grant office. So Campus B requires conflict of interest disclosures and disclosures of other support and foreign components with the grant application. And should anything be disclosed at that point, the Campus B grant office would refer that to Campus A's conflict of interest office as the employer of the researcher. At the time of the grant application, the researcher indicated that he had nothing to disclose, no other support, no foreign components, no conflicts of interest, and the grant was submitted to and funded by NIH. At some point after the grant had been funded, the researcher plans a trip to China and wants the grant to pay for that trip to China. Internally, the grant's accounting office flags this as potentially inappropriate. The department chair of the researcher approves the trip after the researcher provides a justification why it should be paid for, and the researcher travels. It's later discovered that prior to the submission of the grant, the researcher had actually disclosed to Campus A, as part of his regular annual conflict of interest disclosure with his employer, that he was traveling to China to obtain additional data for his NIH-funded study. Campus A conflict of interest office doesn't recognize this as an issue. Next slide, please. So now what happens? We investigate it. Investigation reveals that Campus A was aware of researchers' frequent travel to China, but because Campus A's conflict of interest office wasn't involved in Campus B's grant submission process or research generally, and Campus B didn't communicate with Campus A, this was never communicated to Campus B's grant office. So big communication problems here with multiple disclosure points. It was also revealed that the department chair and the Campus A conflict of interest office both had a significant knowledge gap about the risk of foreign influence, foreign components, and how to issue spot, because no widespread education or communication about the topic had occurred at the university. When asked, the researcher indicated he didn't disclose these relationships or the frequent travel to Chinese universities to Campus B grants office because he already disclosed it to Campus A's conflict of interest office in a recent disclosure. It's the same university, he says. I had nothing new to disclose when Campus B asked. So hopefully none of you have had situations like this, but certainly it's not uncommon for us to see confusion with researchers when there are multiple disclosure points about what they have to disclose. I'll tell you from a conflict of interest perspective, I hear all the time when there are multiple disclosure points, when I update it in one place, why can't you just automatically update it in the other places? And the answer is usually because I don't know where you researcher are required to disclose outside of my sphere of influence in my universe, right? And so that multiple disclosure point can be risky, and we see it even outside of the foreign component piece, or this kind of very extreme hypothetical that we've put forward, where an annual conflict of interest disclosure is updated, but the disclosure to a research sponsor or the FDA is not. And again, researchers being asked to disclose in so many different places, to every journal that they publish in, they can have disclosure fatigue, and they can forget things or feel like when they've already disclosed it once to the institution, that should be sufficient for the entire institution. So for this particular hypothetical, what do we do now? A proposed resolution would probably include repayment of the NIH grant, potential new leadership in the conflict of interest office. Conflict of interest office really needs to be aware of why it could be problematic that a researcher says, I'm going to China to collect some additional data for my research. Is that okay? If nothing else, some significant education needs to happen for a department chair, for the conflict of interest office, and probably across the university. New process to ensure communication between Campus A and Campus B related to disclosure reviews and management of potential conflicts of interest. When you have a multiple campus university or a multiple campus health system, if you have each campus managing processes in a vacuum, in a silo, you could miss things that the other campus knows or has already solicited. And so having a more transparent, open communication, especially when it comes to things like conflict of interest or grant submissions, would be really important. Some of the other things to think about in this scenario are, what about the researcher? Shouldn't he have known that he couldn't go collect research data in China without asking or without vetting that? Except that he did ask, right? He did vet that, and he was told by his department chair it was completely fine, and in fact, the grant paid for it in this hypothetical. Is termination fair for him? What about sanctions for the department chair? If you're making a call like that after something was flagged as potentially inappropriate by the grants accounting office, do you need education, sanctions? And if you're in a university environment and these folks are tenured, that is a whole nother scenario, right? In terms of the due process that is required when you are addressing potential termination or removal of a tenured professor, as well as, potential employment liability from a legal perspective that you might have. So there would be a lot of folks involved in these conversations, but not sure there's a right answer for one size fits all, but certainly in this extreme hypothetical, these things that are listed on the slide are the suggestions that I, as the Chief Compliance Officer or someone in a position of responsibility for research compliance would think about. So with that, I'm going to pass it along to Mary.
Hi, this is Mary, and I'm not sure if anyone can hear me.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about disclosure obligations in general and what type of activities can potentially create conflict of interests that we need to be managed. Sorry, my camera is on now. Okay, so the regulatory obligations have been put out by the Public Health Service, and so that includes NIH and a variety of other agencies that fund research at universities and academic medical centers and hospitals. And basically, in 2011, the conflict of interest regulations were changed and updated so that now the institution has the burden of making an independent determination about whether or not a significant financial interest that's disclosed by an investigator could significantly affect the design, conduct, or reporting of research. And the reason for this is if there are conflicts that are not disclosed or managed, they can be very damaging to both the institution and the individual researchers and potentially to the research participants. And so what we're really concerned about is maintaining the public trust, right? We want our research participants to be willing and interested in participating in research at our institutions. We want the federal government to continue to fund research. We want to make sure our individual physicians and scientists and the universities and institutions all have a reputation for excellent research and management of the different compliance activities as they're necessary for the particular project. As for legal risk, as Kate discussed with foreign influence, there's a lot of legal risk when conflicts are not properly disclosed and not properly managed. And so we could be in a situation of having to pay NIH back for a particular grant, or as those headlines showed, people can be terminated or asked to resign. And that doesn't happen all that often in the university community, but it's definitely much more prevalent in the past year. And also, the reason that the agencies fund research at universities and hospitals and academic medical centers is because we're training the next generation of physicians and scientists. And so we want to make sure as we're doing that training, it's being done in a manner that does not involve people's personal interests, and that conflicted investigators are properly managed so that the trainees are getting the right training at our institutions. And then finally, we want optimal translation of knowledge. We want to advance the field. We want to make new discoveries and get new treatments and drugs and devices out there so that participants can benefit and patients. Next slide, please. So here under individual conflicts, conflicts sound like a bad thing, but they're not always bad. Conflicts are bad when they're not disclosed and not managed, because that's where the damage can take place. But a lot of times people are conflicted because they're very successful in their field. They're either asked to do consulting work, serve as advisors on particular boards or committees. They may be asked to be speakers on particular classes of drugs and products. And the individual themselves may really believe in the company and the products and hold stock. And a person may also be an inventor on a new use of an existing drug. And so all of these things actually are considered significant financial interest, and that is something that is required to be disclosed in their conflict of interest disclosure. But in and of itself, it might not be a conflict today, but it could be a conflict tomorrow. So institutions also can have conflicts. So if we have an inventor who's invented a new use of a drug at your institution, the institution then files the patent application and becomes the patent holder or the patent owner. And then at the point that it can become a conflict is if we want to then test the drug or device at our institution. And another way we can have an institutional conflict is if we have high-level officials who have outside relationships with different companies, and those companies are funding research that's being conducted by researchers that report up to our senior leaders. So those are all different types of conflicts that we could potentially have. Next slide, please. So Kate mentioned disclosure fatigue. So our baseline with any type of conflict management is disclosure. So first, to any research participants on a clinical trial or involved in any other type of human subjects research, we want an explicit disclosure in the consent form so that the subject understands when they're doing the informed consent that there is potentially a conflicted investigator participating. We also want disclosure to all of the study team members so that everyone is aware that this investigator is potentially conflicted. And then finally, in any publication, presentation, press release, any public-facing document. So at Georgetown, I review all press releases that are issued by the medical center related to research. And that's because we want to have a second set of eyes to make sure that if we have any conflicted investigators, that we are putting a disclosure in that press release. So our researchers are very much aware of conflicts disclosures. So if we have an individual, though, who has a conflict, so let's say they're a consultant to a pharmaceutical company, and that company then wants to fund a study in their department, and they would be working on it either as the principal investigator or as an investigator. So depending on the amount of the financial interest, we may not want them to do the data analysis. And in many cases, it's done by the sponsor, so that's not really an institutional issue, but we still put that provision in anyway, just to make sure. And then with subject eligibility determinations, we might want those reviewed by a non-conflicted investigator. We want to make sure that there is strict adherence to the inclusion and exclusion criteria, and there is no subjective selection of subjects from the perspective that maybe a particular subject might show a better result depending on the purpose of the study. And then finally, with consenting patients, we look now at consenting to be a process. And so if we have a conflicted investigator, we don't want any perception that there could be any coercion or undue influence during the consent process. So we typically ask either a non-conflicted investigator or a study team member to be present during the consent process. We also have restrictions from the institutional perspective. I'm going to discuss those as part of the case study on the next slide, please. Okay, so this is a hypothetical as well. So an inventor has discovered that an existing cardiac drug is useful to treat pancreatic disorders. So he's filed his invention disclosure with the tech transfer office, and tech transfer has then filed their patent application with the US Patent and Trademark Office. So the inventor is the named inventor on the patent, and the institution is the patent owner. So now that is now a disclosable activity in the conflict of interest process if people have any IP, intellectual property. But next, the inventor receives NIH clinical trial funding to test this drug on human subjects. And the trial will take place solely, let's say, at Georgetown or at the inventor's institution. So it's not a multi-center study. If this drug is found to be safe and effective, both the inventor as an individual and the institution stand to gain financially. And so as a result, there is a conflict here that has to be managed both with the individual inventor and with the institution. So how would we do that? Next slide, please. So again, I've discussed disclosure. It's the baseline. We want to be extremely transparent in any situation in which we have a conflict. So in this particular case, the inventor discovered the new use of the drug. So we probably don't want him to be involved at all in the clinical trial. So instead, he writes the grant application because he knows the science the best on this. And he probably also writes the investigational new drug application. So the IND has to be obtained by the FDA, and then a DSMB is appointed at that time as well. And but then he might also write the clinical trial protocol, but at the point that that protocol is ready for submission to the IRB, we take our inventor out and then we put in a clinical principal investigator, someone who does not have a conflict, and that person will oversee the study from that point on. So if we're investigating new uses of drugs, we prefer that the studies be blinded and when we have an inventor as part of the process. So we prefer that they be blinded so that both the investigators and the subjects have no idea which drug they're getting, whether they're getting a drug at all, and what dosage. We may ask an external IRB to review the determinations of our own internal IRB. We'll also appoint a study monitor to make sure that all the regulatory requirements are being followed and that the regulatory documentation is in good order in the event of a sponsor audit or an FDA audit. And then we have biostatisticians that do the data analysis. And so if it's a blinded study, they would initially do the analysis with the data still being blinded, and then pass that to a clinical principal investigator. That person can then analyze the data still in a blinded state and determine whether or not there was clinical significance. And then once those activities are done, then it goes to the DSMB. And so the DSMB does meet periodically throughout the study, but they're the ones that do the final review of the data at the end. They do the unblinding, and they then ask whatever questions and request whatever additional information they need from the investigators. At that point, our inventor can be brought back in, and he or she can then write the manuscript. And the manuscript is then written with the clinical investigators as co-author, so that there are multiple eyes on that manuscript. And then when it goes to a journal, it then goes through a peer review process as well. And so then this publication then would also have both the individual and institutional conflict disclosed as part of the paper. Thank you. I'll turn it over to Jim now.
Right. Thanks. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about kind of the role of the IRB in reviewing and managing conflict. If we can go to the next slide. So my primary role at MedStar is within the Office of Research Integrity, which is, kind of helping to manage and support the IRB process. And I tend to think of the IRB committee and IRB staff's role in conflict of interest as somewhat peripheral, right? So we're not really, we're to some extent involved, We need to be aware of it, but we're not actually the people that have the responsibility for reviewing and setting management plans when conflicts do arise. We do tend to watch in the applications for red flags that may not have been picked up by compliance office, and may need to make a referral to the compliance office for different sorts of things. Another thing I think that helps, that sort of muddies the waters, right, and kind of confuses people about the IRB role is that we do, since we're aware of the COI process, we do help facilitate communication. So we will pass information back and forth between the compliance office and the research teams, in an attempt to try and resolve any possible or potential issues. There are also some cases where the IRB may set a more stringent requirement than a management plan. And I think in my experience in the last 10 years, that's a pretty rare occurrence. But the IRB does have the ability, if they look at a management plan and say that, this may be appropriate from a legal perspective, we feel that more should be done from a human protection standpoint. So while the board can't relax the requirements of the management plan, they could set a higher standard. That doesn't necessarily become a part of the management plan, but a part of the IRB requirement. If we can go to the next slide. I think we have one additional case study that I'd like to go over that I think kind of helps clarify or demonstrate the role of the IRB in facilitating communication. So we had a situation where an investigator was going to use an FDA approved device for a study, but they're going to modify the device slightly. So they had to apply for an IDE from the FDA. And they were going to use a piece of surgical wire to modify the device for the use in the study. And although the wire that they were going to use was available through multiple sources from multiple manufacturers, the protocol specified one in particular manufacturer. And in the course of reviewing conflict disclosures, it was discovered that one of the investigators had a significant financial interest in the manufacturer that was going to supply the wire that would be used for this particular study. So the question is, does that require a management plan? Does that constitute a conflict? And if we can go to the next slide, we'll see that the answer is it depends, really. So this is sort of a supply chain issue. And if we look at our two possible scenarios, if the individual with the financial interest is dictating that the product to be used comes from the company with which they have a significant interest, then yes, most likely there's going to be a management plan required, because they're actually saying, we're going to buy this product from the company that I have an interest in. If, on the other hand, the investigator with the significant interest is not the one selecting the product, right? So they're not specifically saying we need to buy this product from that company, but someone else who's, say, in charge of supplying the operating rooms for the institution is purchasing from that company, then it's kind of incidental, right? It's not, they haven't made the selection. And in that case, most likely, it would not be considered a conflict that requires a management. And in this case, so this is actually a very similar case to something that happened not that long ago with MedStar. And really, there was kind of not a direct line of communication between the the study team and the individuals reviewing the conflict. So one of the things that we did was to help facilitate the communication, right? So we spoke with the study team to get a clear understanding of what their position was and how the study was being conducted, and then communicated that information to the compliance office so that they could resolve the issues and then determine, the most appropriate path forward. If we can go to the next slide. So that's, I think, I think that example kind of helps us understand where the lines kind of get blurred between the IRB and the folks that actually are reviewing and managing conflict. But we also wanted to talk a little bit about, tie back into the COVID-19 and, where there may or may not be able to be some flexibility in the current situation. If we can go to the next slide. So, even in the current environment that we're existing in, there are regulatory requirements. And as we all know, human subjects research is highly regulated, right? And so we have to be compliant with our protocols that were approved by the IRB and with institutional policies and federal regulations and those kinds of things. Where we may be able to have some flexibility is in kind of when there's a conflict, right, in managing the conflict and coming to a verbal agreement initially to allow the research to move forward in emergent situations and then allow the paperwork to catch up later, right? So that's not something we would normally do. Normally, before we would want to approve a study and have it started, we'd have everything kind of tied down up front. But, we may be able to allow some flexibility in those terms. I think particularly in times like this, communication is the key between the IRBs, the study teams, principal investigators, conflict officers, all of these people. I think, communicating early and communicating often is really the key in figuring out when flexibility is needed. And I think if we can go to the next slide, when flexibility is needed and where it might be able to be applied. The federal agencies in this time have been fairly responsive in giving us some guidance on, their opinions of where flexibility may be able to be applied, including the NIH for their funded studies. But very specifically, I think it's important to keep in mind that the flexibility does not include a waiver of COI obligations, right? So those obligations are still there and we still have to be compliant with them. One of the examples the NIH gives is during the response to the pandemic, a situation where an investigator on an NIH funded grant had to return home to a foreign country, but is intended to continue to work remotely during COVID-19. And the question is, does that have to be reported to the NIH as a foreign component? The answer is yes, right? That activity now is happening in another country, right? So we have to be compliant with the requirements there. So I think, in the interest of time, I'll try to wrap things up in case there are questions. But I think, again, one of the things I stress to our research community at MedStar, and I think is really important, is to communicate early and communicate often. So if you have a situation where you think some flexibility could be applied or might be necessary, get in touch with your IRB and your compliance officers as soon as you can and try to get that clarification. If we can go to the next slide. I think that brings us back to Hiromi.
Yes, I am here. Thank you to our panelists. And if all of our speakers can turn on your video and your audio, we will now open it up for questions. Okay, we have a question, and this is to Mary. If the inventor does receive income or royalties on their drug invention through the institution, this income does not have to be reported as in significant financial interest, correct?
Yes, that is correct. And thank you for asking that question so I can clarify. Yes, if it comes in through the institution, it does not have to be reported. But I can tell you my experience at Georgetown is that a lot of times that does get reported. And it ends up being more helpful to me because we do require a disclosure in the consent form in those situations. But it is not a requirement by the federal regulations, no.
Thank you, Mary. I wanted to go back to the case study that Kate that used in her presentation. Kate, how would you envision this could have been better approached, right? What are some of the mechanisms that could have been put in place? It seems as if the researcher did disclose, unfortunately did not disclose to the appropriate office, right? But they did disclose. So how would you what mechanisms would you put in place, or what do you think would have been a better approach in this specific case study?
Yeah, so I mean, I think a lot of us focus on educating our researchers or folks who have disclosure obligations on what they have to disclose, what they have to ask permission for, things like that. But we don't always do a great job of educating our peers and the research administrators or other administrators who might be participating in the review of these disclosures. And so certainly in the hypothetical that we proposed, the fact that the department chair and somebody responsible for reviewing conflict of interest disclosures didn't recognize a red flag for somebody going to collect additional research data in a foreign country is problematic. And that education could have potentially prevented that from getting as far as it did. I think also, you know, our grants accounting people are in those positions for a reason, right? I don't work in grants accounting because that's not my area of expertise, and I don't want it to be. It's complicated and intricate, right? But we've got those people who do have expertise in that. And so when they raise a red flag and they say, you know, we probably shouldn't do this, we need to think really long and hard before we overrule them and say, nah, go ahead, no problem, it's fine, right? And so I think deference to expertise that you have in-house is also really important. And then those multiple disclosure points, there, you know, to me, that is such an area of discomfort when you have within the same institution, multiple disclosure points, multiple people reviewing different disclosures and no communication, right? Had the two campuses just spoken with each other, even if campus B, who was processing the grant, had just asked campus A, hey, do you have anything on file for this guy? At least they, as the grants office, might have recognized the red flag that had not previously been recognized by the conflict office had that question been asked and the information been sent over, right? So looking at the disclosure fatigue, looking at multiple disclosure points, and that communication, for sure.
Okay, thank you. So I want to segue into this, you know, what we're dealing with now, but yet still keep that foreign influence, right? How do we reconcile that now when we heard from the keynote speaker as far as collaborating, global collaborations, because we've got to learn about this virus, right? The more we learn, the quicker we learn, the better we can understand how the mechanisms, the virus itself, vaccines and treatments and therapeutic treatments, but yet we have this foreign influence, you know, set of concerns, right? So opening it up to the panel, how can we do this with understanding and appreciating the concerns for IP theft, right? But yet have that urgency in place where we have to collaborate globally. You know, in China, that is ground zero, right? Comments?
Yeah, I would start by saying, remember that these NIH policies are not saying that you can't have foreign components to your research. It's just that you have to disclose them, right? And the NIH has to be okay with those foreign components. There's nothing in their policy that says we're not going to collaborate with foreign institutions or individuals who have appointments at foreign institutions or allow some of the scientific work to be conducted outside of the country. These policies are really about disclosure and about the NIH being fully informed about all of those components before they make a decision to fund or continue to fund this research. So I think there's space for both. They're not mutually exclusive.
I would agree with Kate. I have been doing a lot of training and awareness on campus with our faculty, going to faculty department meetings so that the department chair is present, a lot of the deans are present, the council of chairs. And that's the message we've been sending, that we're not trying to chill the collaboration, but we want them to be aware of what the government's concerns are and about the loss of US intellectual property to foreign countries.
Thank you. And we're gonna end with Jim. I'd like for you to comment, as you said, you kind of endured some of these experiences with COVID-19, and how can we ethically ensure, right, or ensure that we are conducting the research in an ethical manner, yet still balance, right, the urgency, but and be flexible, right? How flexible do we need to be, and what are some of the things that we should consider moving forward?
I think, you know, a lot of what we've done at MedStar in terms of flexibility is prioritizing the COVID specific research in terms of review, right? Like get it to review as soon as possible. And there have been, you know, we've done some things where, you know, we've convened special sessions of the IRB, right? So call an extra meeting to get something reviewed more quickly. Still making sure that it, you know, we're within the bounds of the regulations and within institutional policy, but trying to respond a little more quickly. And in some cases, applying flexibility in the regulations where we can, right? Not only to kind of move things along a little faster, but to make sure we're protecting research participants and the research staff to the extent that we can, right? So places where we can allow for either a waiver or an alteration to documentation of consent. So somebody doesn't have to go into the room for an extra visit with somebody who's already tested positive, right? Give them an alternative to do kind of a remote consent and an alternate documentation of the consent. So some of those kind of things. But again, I think the keys are, one, you know, the regulations and the policies still apply. We just need to be careful to look for the places where there can be some flexibility that we can apply. And I think, again, communication is the key, right? Letting folks know early and, you know, communicating often. And, you know, we've given our investigators some kind of some tools to use to easily flag a study as COVID specific, so we can grab it and respond to it quickly.
Excellent. Unfortunately, that is our time. Time flies when we're having fun. But thank you, Jim, for that response, because that segues perfectly into our next panel. I want to thank our speakers. It was a joy working with you all, and I hope thank you for the audience for tuning in. And I have the distinct pleasure of introducing our next panel and moderator, so I'll go ahead and do that now. Panel 3 is Accelerated Clinical Trials, Adapting to the Pace.